Are there any other issues here? Yeah. All right, everyone. So we are ready with the next topic, and that is soil and its pollution. Now, in your syllabus, it says soil pollution, but there are several issues related to soil that are not necessarily about pollution, but about the degradation of soil. So, from an agricultural perspective, you have to realize that soil is one of the most precious resources that will determine the level of productivity. So I've modified the topic a little bit and called it soil and its pollution. We are going to look at two aspects. We're going to look at soil degradation and pollution, and the focus is going to be on degradation rather than pollution. So before we get into the details of the topic, let's just keep an eye on what is soil, how is it formed, and why do we talk about soil degradation and pollution? So the definition of soil is that the unconsolidated geologic material that is located at the surface of the earth. So it's part of the crust and it's a very, very thin layer. So when you think about the depth of the crust and so on, this is just the top 2 meters. So it's like a thin skin on the planet, on the crust, on the terrestrial part of the planet. So the process of generating soil or forming soil is called pedogenesis, and there are 3 categories of factors. So soil, the nature of soil is going to depend on 2 major factors: vegetation and climate. And so climate is an independent factor, but vegetation and soil have an intimate relationship with each other to the extent that the vegetation modifies the soil and results in a soil that will encourage certain species of vegetation to thrive in it. So that's why we have this circular kind of relationship between soils and vegetation. And both together are determined by climatic factors, among other factors. Now, in terms of the role of soils, what is the role of soil? The first thing is what I just mentioned in the beginning of the topic. I said it's a support medium. Agricultural productivity depends on soil. It provides the media for roots to spread out, and that is why it's called a support medium for the plants and so on. That is the most obvious one. It helps to regulate the amount of moisture and nutrients that are available. So when we talk about agricultural productivity, we are looking at the availability of moisture and nutrients. If the soil is poor in terms of organic content, what will happen? It will be sandy in nature, and sandy material does not have any water retention capacity. You can just think about beach sand and riverbed sand and so on. It has zero water retention capacity. Water will flow through right away, right? So if the particle size is smaller, if the organic content is higher, then you get higher water as well as nutrient retention capacity. And this is crucial for agricultural productivity. Then, without forgetting the ecological part of it, it's a habitat for various organisms. So from rodents to worms, all of them, and insects, and so many other organisms have their habitat, and that this has several aspects to it. They build their homes inside the soil. They lay their eggs or they build their nests and so on inside the soil. I've even seen certain types of birds which can lay their eggs inside the this kind of material. So this kind of thing can happen. It's not just for reptiles and so on. It can be for the birds as well. So that is all. It's a habitat. It's a very crucial part of any ecosystem because it serves as a habitat for various organisms, both microbial as well as higher organisms. And let me tell you that soil is perhaps the most it's the richest media, it's the richest part of the environment in terms of microbial habitat, and the higher organisms are also there. And finally, last but not the least, it's an important engineering resource. So you would not be having all these buildings around you, your buildings, your roads, everything around you that you see that is constructed materials are all based on understanding the nature of soils and basically using them as an engineering resource as well as using them as construction material. And our understanding of soils is essential for designing foundations and what else? That's it. Okay, what are the environmental impacts of soil? So as I said, the vegetation of any area is fully dependent on the nature of the soil, and the nature of the soil in turn is modified by the growth of plants that will find that soil conducive for their growth, and in turn the whole ecosystem is around, it's literally centered around soil. Okay, so if you look at any ecosystem, you know, the whole full circle cannot be completed without soil as its main part. So the availability of nutrients, of water for plant growth, that will determine the texture of soil and other soil properties, the size and the composition of the soil particles, the organic content, moisture content. There is a very important parameter in agricultural science and engineering, which is called cation exchange capacity. Now that is crucial for agricultural productivity. So when you have acidic soil versus alkaline soil, when you think in terms of the availability of nutrients, all of that is based on cation exchange capacity. And the availability of nutrients, they are generally in the form of either cations and ions, and all of that will determine the productivity of that soil. I've already mentioned that buildings, structures, foundations, all of them will be affected by soil. Any soil is by nature, it's going to be, the soil ecosystem is going to be location specific, and most of these soil-based ecosystems are self-sustaining. So the ability of soil to create self-sustaining ecosystems is very important. That's why it has a huge role to play in terms of the sustainability and the stability of ecosystems. This is very crucial. And I've already mentioned that it's a habitat for organisms, all the way from microbial, smallest organisms, to the highest, are dependent on soil for anything or everything, because the vegetation will determine the nature of the ecosystem. So it all goes full circle with soil as a very major component of this ecosystem, of any ecosystem for that matter. So what are the factors that affect the nature of soil and how it forms? The two biggest climatic factors, and we saw this when we went through ecology, those are rainfall or precipitation and temperature. So when we think about rainfall, the leaching of minerals. So when we think in terms of nutrient availability, where are those nutrients? Those nutrients are locked up in the minerals that are comprising soil. So leaching of these cations and anions from the soil particles, that is what we are looking at when we look at the leaching of minerals. So that is the loss. It's lost from the point of view of the soil, but it's gain if the plants take it up. And if it's lost as surface runoff or it's lost with wind and water action, then obviously that's dead loss. Okay, then we come to wet deposition of particulate matter and minerals from the atmosphere. You're all aware of the fact that wind and water, whether it's thunderstorms or cyclones or whatever it is, so it's the action of wind and water that transports particulate matter and minerals from the atmosphere. Now, if there is precipitation along with the wind, then you get what is called wet deposition of particulate matter and minerals. So that is gain for the soil. So the net mass of soil in a particular area will be increased because of wet deposition, and losses are because of leaching. Then we come to temperature. Temperature is physical weathering. You know for a fact that your daily cycles of high temperature and low temperature. So you have high temperature in the afternoon, you have low temperature after midnight, early in the morning. So this will lead to contraction and expansion of the rock material. So you have physical weathering, which leads to contraction and expansion of the bedrock, which is what we call the parent material of soil. So this will result in physical weathering of the bedrock, and this bedrock will contribute to the formation of soil. So when we talk about pedogenesis, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at how is soil formed. Then we come to chemical weathering. Now, the rainwater itself is acidic, and I think I mentioned it, yes. In water pollution, I mentioned to you that the current pH of rainwater, which is relatively unpolluted, or you might say that rainwater that is in equilibrium with CO2, the current levels of CO2 in the atmosphere have resulted in a rainwater pH of 5.6. Now, this rainwater is obviously acidic. So when it falls on any type of rock, this is going to cause what we call chemical weathering. So acids in the rainwater will cause breakdown of the rock. It will result in certain amount of erosion of the rock. And because of that, you will get the formation of soil in response to chemical weathering. I've already mentioned that it's a major habitat for a huge diversity of organisms, starting with microbes like bacteria, fungi, algae. All of them will grow in and on soil. And if you haven't seen it, take a potted plant and observe what happens. You will get all three of these groups of microorganisms. It's very easy, and it's dirt easy, literally. And smaller animals, you've seen them around you. There are earthworms, snails, insects, other small burrowing animals. You have rats and moles and any number of creatures that find their habitat in the soil. Okay, so they all make their homes either based on soil or inside soil, and they will modify it. I've written only chemically and biologically, but I can tell you it's physically, chemically, and biologically modified by all the organisms that make soil their home or habitat. The digestion of organic matter that is present in the soil is based on the presence of microbes and small animals. So all these organisms are responsible for the digestion of organic matter. So these leaves and twigs and branches that you see falling all over the soil, how does their decomposition happen? So this digestion of organic matter and the breakdown of minerals by acids happens because of the digestion by all these organisms that call soil their habitat. So that is a huge part of the formation of soil. Then we come to topography. Now, weathering at high altitudes is going to be much greater than weathering at lower altitudes. So if you have high variations in temperature and wind patterns, then that will increase or decrease. So greater variation in climatic factor means greater amount of weathering. Less variation in climatic factors means less amount of weathering. So it is the fluctuation in these two factors that will determine the level of weathering, and also that is going to be related to topography. So the best example is, think about the weathering on the windward side versus the leeward side. So all you have to do is imagine hills and mountains. You have the wind beating on one side and the other side is protected from the wind. So that's the leeward side. And the nature of soil that is formed on the windward side is going to be very different from what you see on the leeward side, for the simple reason that the weathering rate is going to be different. The parent material is the same, but the rate of weathering is very, very different. So this is the biggest reason. Okay. Then we come to parent material. What is the parent material? That is the bedrock. So the soil has several layers. I will be showing you that right here. So these are this is sort of a generalized classification of what is called soil horizons. So anytime you see a construction site, you can take a closer look and you'll find very clear layers. Almost all of them will have 2, 3, 4 layers. It depends on the nature of the site, of course, but at the bottom is the bedrock. So this bedrock is also the parent material because everything above it is coming from the weathering of the bedrock. So this D or R horizon, some textbooks use the term D horizon, others call it R horizon, and this is the original source of soil material. So this is the parent material. The weathering of this material will result in the generation of soil. Now, you've heard the term mature soils and young soils. So mature means old. Older or mature soils are very different from young soils. Now, when we talk about soils, we're not talking in terms of 1 or 2 years. We are talking about tens to hundreds of years. It takes a long time to create a layer of soil in a particular area. Okay. So mature to older soils are different from younger soils in terms of the retention of parent material and the percentage of organic matter. So you can just imagine that where is the soil being formed? It's being formed by two forces. One is the weathering. Those are the physical, chemical, and biological forces. But you also have the organic content, which is coming from different sources. So the vegetation is contributing to the organic content, and even the non-vegetation organic content like dead animal mass and so on, that is also going to contribute to the total organic matter. Now, older soils will automatically accumulate greater amounts of organic matter, and this greater amount of organic matter is what makes the soil dark. It's what we use, the term we use for this organic matter is humus, H-U-M-U-S. H-U-M-U-S, that is humus, and it has two major parts to it, humic and fulvic acids. And the fulvic acids are low molecular weight, humic acids are large molecular weight. It's going a little too far, but older soils are known by higher percentage of organic matter and therefore automatically lower percentage of parent material. And younger soils, because they have not accumulated as much organic matter as the older soils, that's why they have more parent material and less organic matter. Okay. There are several other processes that are part of these soil formation or pedogenesis processes, and that is calcification, salinization, and laterization. So calcification is removal of salts other than calcium and magnesium. Okay, so that is what causes calcification. And I think the most obvious thing that we see over here is you get these white crystals in salt. I'm sorry, white crystals in soil, and they're all crystals of calcium and perhaps magnesium. Then we come to salinization. Now, salinization is also visually evident in some cases. If you go to arid and semi-arid regions of any country, including ours, you will find that after this water has evaporated from the top layer, this is evident in fields. If you see them in fields, it's very obvious, but it can also happen in soil, obviously, in other places. Most evident in fields. When you see the moisture content has evaporated, you have this thin layer of whitish looking material, which is nothing but your common salt. NaCl and some other salts will be forming a whitish crust on the surface. So this is accumulation of salts due to evaporation in arid and semi-arid regions. In our part of the world, here in West Bengal and Kharagpur, what you see is laterization. So here the soil is very high in laterite content. It has accumulated iron and aluminum in quite large amounts, and this is iron-rich soil in this part of the world. So there is a huge amount of accumulation of iron and aluminum, and this is typical of humid tropical environments. Then we come to composition. So in terms of composition, we have, this is a very generalized composition. So you have the mineral particles, which are almost 50%, so 45% is mineral particles, water is 25%, air is 25%. It's never so neat. Any soil sample will deviate from this composition in a major way, depending on where you are. This is just to show you that these are the different parts of soil. Okay, so these numbers can vary quite a bit. It can be as low as, it can be higher, it can be 60%, 70%, even more. Okay, organic matter in this particular example is 5%. Now, within this organic matter, humus is 80%, roots are 10%, and organisms are another 10% by weight. Let's take a quick look at soil horizons. So soil horizons, right at the top, we have the O horizon. O stands for organic matter. So all the organic matter that is contributing to the organic content of the soil is basically right here at the top. Now, as it decomposes, it will decompose. It's organic in nature, so decomposition is inevitable, yes. And the material that is formed during the decomposition process. So the end point we know is you get CO2, you get ammonia, you get hydrogen sulfide, you get water, all these things. Now, all these materials that are the end products of decomposition will infiltrate into the lower horizons. So at the A horizon, you have the zone of leaching. So this rich organic matter will start leaching into the subsurface. So A1 is rich in organic content from the decomposition process in the O horizon. A2 is high in mineral content, and A3 is the transition between A and B. B is the zone of accumulation. Now, some of the materials that are leaching through the soil are not going to be able to go too far. So there comes a point at which they start accumulating, and B is the zone of accumulation. So B1 is again a transition zone between A and B. B2 is where you get maximum accumulation of the colloid material. And B3 is the transition from B to C. Now, C is the weathered rock, and below that you have the bedrock. So this bedrock will get weathered, it will break up into fragments. This C will further contribute to B, A, and not O. O is organic. Okay, so that's these are the horizons in a nutshell. The depth of soil or the thickness of the layer of soil is dependent on the climatic factors and the vegetation. So I've already mentioned all these points, but let's take a look at some examples. So this is the depth from the surface. In the first graphic, you see depth from the surface. It's very thick in the tropical region. So you can see in tropical region, you have rich vegetation. They are rich in vegetation. So the amount of organic matter that falls on the surface is also going to be very high, and that contributes to the formation of soil. So the depth of soil automatically is going to be higher. That is the amount of vegetation which is going to be higher, highest in fact in the tropics. There are two factors that contribute to this. One is the high amount of vegetation, and the second is the high temperature. High temperature means that the decomposition processes are faster. So the vegetation is born quickly, it dies quickly, it contributes more to the organic content of the soil. So the rate at which soil is formed in the tropics is much greater than the rate at which soil will form in temperate or Arctic regions. Then we come to the desert. What happens in the desert? It's still hot. The temperature is high, but the parent material is dominant and the layer of soil is very, very thin in comparison to highly vegetated tropical regions. Okay, so here the amount of vegetation is very low, even though the temperature is fairly high, and the layer of soil that will be formed is much, much less. Then we come to temperate regions. Temperate regions, you know, are milder in terms of temperatures compared to the tropics. You will get a large amount of vegetation, but it's mostly seasonal vegetation. So the amount of biomass that will contribute to the let me put it another way, the amount of biomass that is born and then will fall back on the soil and get decomposed is not as much as it is in the tropical regions. Okay, so this is the temperate region. So you can see that the depth of soil, it's a relative way of looking at things. The temperate regions are high in vegetation, but not as high as the tropical regions. Okay, so completely directly proportionate to the amount of vegetation, you will find that the depth of soil is less than what it is in the tropics, but more than what you would expect in the deserts. So you can see this over here. And finally, we come to the coldest regions, Arctic, Antarctic. These are the frigid regions where very little vegetation grows. So the amount of vegetation that grows is only seasonal, and it's also very less compared to, let's say, the tropics. The temperature is also very less, so the rate of decomposition is very low, and that's why soil formation is also very, very slow in these areas compared to the tropics and the other regions. Okay, so that's it. Then we come to weathering of soils and the formation of soils. So I've already mentioned that soils are weathered by physical, chemical, and to some extent biological processes as well, because when you have organisms like bacteria, algae, and fungi growing in the soil, they secrete acids, and this acid will contribute to the weathering of the soil material. So that is also part of the weathering of soils. You can't do away with that. Yeah. So physical or mechanical weathering, chemical weathering, all of that is part of it. Soil texture is based on particle size. There are three major categories: clay, silt, and sand. Clay is the finest material. Anything less than 2 microns or 0.002 millimeters is clay. This is the definition in the textbook. Silt is from 2 microns to 60 microns. Sand is from 60 microns and higher, so all the way up to 2 millimeters. This is what we call a soil texture triangle. So you have clay, silt, and sand on three sides, and the nomenclature for defining a particular type of soil is based on this triangle. So if somebody says this is sandy loam, so let's look at sandy loam. So sandy loam has a lot of sand, anywhere from 50 to 70% sand. And how much clay does it have? About 15 to 20% clay. It has no silt. So that is sandy loam. Silty loam, on the other hand, has some amount of sand, 20 to 50% sand, and 75 to 90% silt. And you can see silt, pure silt is right here from 90 to 100% with very little amount of sand, or the other way around. So you can have all different kinds of combinations of these three types of materials, and that is the nomenclature that is used for classifying different types of soils. As I said, we are going to focus on degradation of soil and pollution, and these are two very different issues, and we're going to go over both. Let's start with degradation. So when I say the soil in a particular region is being degraded, what are we talking about? The first thing is soil erosion. The biggest problem that is common almost everywhere in the world is that soil is being eroded, and this is a productive and precious resource, especially for countries that are dependent for their economy on agriculture. So soil erosion is one of the biggest topics, and that happens for two reasons. One is deforestation. We are losing our forest cover, so that is resulting in soil erosion. And the second is overgrazing. So when you have large numbers of cattle and livestock, and you allow them to overgraze on certain areas, the end result of that overgrazing is barren land. So you can turn, what happens in many places, it has happened, is that fertile land has become barren because of overgrazing. Then we come to nutrient depletion. Now, I've already mentioned that for agriculture-dependent economies, nutrient depletion can destroy the economy because you're losing these precious nutrients which are locked up in soil. So soil erosion will also result in depletion of nutrients, and that is again loss of agricultural productivity. Then we come to soil salinization. One of the impacts of irrigation projects all over the country is that farmers become what is the word I want to use? Farmers, when they have access to what seems like unlimited water, and this happens with irrigation projects all over the world perhaps, they overwater their fields. There is no conservation of water when you have ample supply of water. So this overwatering or over-irrigation of fields and other areas results in the long term in what we call soil salinization, because the water evaporates and the salts in the salts that are in the water will form a crust, and the salt content of soil increases over a period of time, and that will again decrease the agricultural productivity. Then we come to soil degradation. More about that. So soil serves as a base for crop and livestock production, and we know that soil fertility is going to determine two things. Not just, I've been focusing on agricultural productivity, but I should also mention that the ability to keep a herd of cattle and sheep and goat and all that, that is also based on soil fertility, because if you don't have grass, if you don't have fodder crops, you're not going to have livestock productivity. So it's not just agricultural productivity, but livestock also, that depends on soil fertility. Then we have nutrients in soil that will determine its productivity and the nature of the crop that you can grow. I've already mentioned two major problems: overgrazing and soil pollution, soil erosion. And then we have agriculture and crop production. So when we think about agricultural productivity, there are three categories of crops. One is food crops. Food crops, as is evident, whatever we eat, that is considered a food crop. These can be vegetables, grains, legumes, anything that is edible. Then comes forage crops. Fodder crops or forage crops. These are the terms that are used for grazing and livestock production. So the cattle, the cows, buffaloes, sheep, goats, camels, whatever you can think of that are domesticated animals, they live by grazing, and the production of livestock depends on forage crops. And finally, you have cash crops. Cash crops are crops like cotton, silk, jute, bamboo. All these are considered cash crops because they are providing materials for that are contributing to the economy of the place, but they don't fit into either the food or the forage category. They are more of commercial use. Yeah. So that's one thing. Then we come to the next thing, and what is the relationship between area under agriculture versus population? As I started in the entire this class, I started with population growth. So it's only right to not entirely full circle, but let's take a look at how crop land compares in terms of population growth. So the important message here, I will let you go through this on your own when I upload the slides, but the important take home over here is very simple. The population on the planet is growing. The area under crop per person is decreasing by definition, because there are two things that are happening, in fact, in almost all developing countries. I don't know the state of affairs in developed countries, but at least in developing countries, the amount of land under crop cover is decreasing, and the population is increasing. So there are two factors again that are leading to less crop area per person. There is no time factor in this table, but this is about the distribution of cropland. You can see a country like Australia has the highest amount of crop area per person, and in Asia, I think we are the lowest. So we have the highest population densities, and we have less crop area per person compared to all the other continents. So currently, the world average is 38%. And even though Asia still has a good amount of cropland as a percentage of the total land, it is, I don't think it's increasing, I think it's decreasing. And the quality of the land in terms of fertility is also going down. Then we come to soil, some more factors about soil erosion. So how do we control soil erosion? So once we know that yes, soil erosion, soil salinity are major problems, what can we do to control it? So the first thing we need to understand is, why does soil erosion happen? The first thing is wind, rain, temperature variations. The second is deforestation and change in land use, land cover. So we are converting forested areas to agricultural use. That is one of the biggest shifts in land use, land cover that is happening over fairly long periods of time. And when you have large irrigation projects and so on, so they all contribute to this shift from forested areas to agricultural areas. And with the population growing, it becomes even more and more important to do this conversion. And unfortunately, it results in many other problems. So you have soil erosion, and because of this shift from forested land to agricultural land. Now, in many parts of the world, you have only 1 or 2 maximum growing seasons, and these growing seasons may be 3-month long or 4-month long. What happens during the dry season when there is nothing growing on the soil or on the field? At that time, especially if it is summer and there is very little moisture, you get dust storms. So these dust storms can happen due either to plowing or to drought conditions, or due to seasonal variations in terms of precipitation and so on. So I am from Gujarat. I know that dust storms are a seasonal thing. It's not because of plowing, it's not because of drought conditions. It just happens every summer. It's part of the weather pattern. But it also is an indicator of soil erosion, because let's say you have more and more land that is barren. The amount of dust carried by the wind when you have barren land is going to be much greater. So if the land use gets converted, and I've already said this about overgrazing, I've already said this about when you convert the fields, or let me put it another way, when you have fields and they are lying fallow, either because of drought or because of the natural seasonal variations in climate and so on, all this contributes to dust storms, and that will increase if the area under the area that is barren increases. So that's a huge problem. And in arid and semi-arid, so Gujarat, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, these are areas that are all arid and semi-arid regions of the country, and they have a huge problem with dust storms. Then we have soil salinity. I've already said that excessive use of water for irrigation is what is causing soil salinity, and that reduces agricultural productivity over a period of time. If you are using groundwater for irrigation, which is again a new trend that has emerged in the last 3 to 4 decades, perhaps, this groundwater contains TDS. So the total dissolved solids in groundwater are generally more than surface water. So this irrigation trend, which has started in the country, will lead to greater salinization, and the consequence in the long term will be reduced soil productivity. As I said, soil erosion is the loss of a precious resource that takes 10 to hundreds of years to create, because it's a natural and slow process, and the only thing one can do is to put in best management practices to prevent loss of good soil. What are the environmental impacts of soil erosion? There are huge amounts of environmental impacts due to soil erosion. One is pollution of surface water bodies due to excess nutrients and sediment. If you observe what happens in any of the high rainfall areas, what you will find is that every time there is a thunderstorm, a huge amount of soil goes along with the surface runoff, and it's carrying excess nutrients as well as sediment, which is going to cause eutrophication of surface water bodies. So this is a huge problem in terms of environmental impacts. Then you get silting of dams and reservoirs and choking of wetland ecosystems. I've already mentioned overgrazing. So when you have grazing for livestock production that is required, you can maintain optimum densities. So if I have not too many livestock grazing on a particular patch of land, the soil will actually be enriched by the fecal deposits and the recycling of nutrients. That is what nature does. And the grazing animals actually prune. They take the top and the tips of new tender grass and so on, and they also get some good nutrition from it, and the pruning of the grass helps in stimulating further growth. So at the optimum level, it's actually beneficial for the land. What happens in overgrazing is that the rate of grazing is greater than the growth rate of grass. So what happens is the animals are no longer pruning the tips of the grass, but they are, in some cases, they are biting down to the root level. Okay, so that will result in depletion of nutrients. The grass will be completely depleted. The roots that hold the soil together will not be present anymore. They will either dry up or just be pulled out. I'm not so sure about that, but they will dry up and lead to soil erosion. There will be excessive manure on the land or the pastures, and that will enter the streams, again contributing to eutrophication of the water bodies. I will stop with the next point, and this is the universal soil loss equation. Now, this LE. This is the universal soil loss equation, which we can always debate about. But anyways, A is the annual soil loss per unit area per year. So this itself, it's an empirical equation based on statistical data for the US for different soils, but it's used in many other applications. Okay, then A is equal to R times K times L times S times C times P. So what are all these factors? So R is rainfall and runoff. So I've already mentioned that when you have erosion, what are we trying to determine? We're trying to determine the total amount of soil lost per unit area, per unit time, or per unit year, not per unit, per year. Okay, so it's tons of soil per acre per year, or tons per hectare per year. Then you have rainfall and runoff factor. Before we come to rainfall and runoff factor, let me see what else I have here. The text does have a lot of these numbers, and they are all specific for certain conditions. So let me just do that. Yeah. Okay. So this is to predict how much soil will be lost for a given area. Okay. That is obviously going to depend on rainfall and runoff. So the intensity of the rainfall, because if the rainfall comes down with high intensity, so you get very high amount of rain in a short period of time, that means rainfall intensity is higher, and that's a lot of kinetic energy which is going to loosen the soil, and it will contribute to greater soil erosion. So according to the principle behind this soil and surface runoff factor is that running water has less energy, much less energy in it as compared to rainfall. So rainfall and runoff together are clubbed together as what is called rainfall erosion index. And this R value, at least in the text, which is based for US values, I have seen one paper for Indian values, and I think there are a lot of people who are working in this area. So there may be several people who have done work even in India. So that is there. Okay, so these are all factors that have to be determined for different conditions. So that is the rainfall and runoff factor. K is the soil erodibility factor for a unit plot. Now everything is with reference to what is called a unit plot. And this unit plot is a somewhat hypothetical construct. 5.5 feet by 72.6 feet with a slope of 9%, assuming that it is regularly and continuously tilled. Tilled means you're going to have these furrows, okay? And it's kept fallow. Nothing is growing in it. It will be uphill and downhill along the slope. This is the worst case scenario. Almost, this is like asking for complete erosion of the soil. So this is the baseline for comparing all other plots, assuming that everything else is better than this situation. So K is the soil erodibility factor. LS is a combination of slope length and steepness. So it's not just enough to know the degree of the slope, but also the steepness factor, and the two are clubbed together. So soil loss from the field is basically what this factor is. And so like I said, it's clubbed together, at least in all the textbooks that give factors for it. It's also called the topographic factor, and it is given for the length of the slope and the degree of the steepness. So I think I should say that, yeah. So degree of the slope, the degree of steepness, that is the. C is the cover and management factor. Now, cover and management factor is you can have all kinds of different combinations of crops, and you can have certain management practices. Okay, so this C value is a cover and management factor, which is determined. Again, these are all empirical factors which are given for the number. There are several permutations that are given in the text for no tillage, minimum tillage, conventional tillage, which means how often is the field being tilled, and what are the crops that are growing in it, how many seasons are the crops being grown for. That tells you the cover factor. That's the cover and management factor. And is there any fallow period? So all of this comes under C. And the last one is P. P is the support practice factor. So I'll show you something here. So this is what is called contour farming. Now, contour farming is supposed to be the um, least problematic in terms of soil erosion. So you know that when you have contour farming, this is terracing. So it's a combination of terracing and contour farming. This is also contour farming and terracing, where the slope of the hillside is much steeper compared to what you see here for the US. Okay, so in either case, it's contour farming or terracing, and this results in the least level of soil erosion. So these are P levels, P values. I should have shown. When I was talking about all these factors, let me show you examples of how to do that. So these are K values for different soils. These are this is the slope, length, and steepness factor. So you have the slope on one side and the length of the slope on the other side, okay, of the table. So you can pick your factors. And then you have crop management or C values for different sequences of crops. So different, how many crops per year, what is the sequence of crops, what is the level of tillage, is the residue left or removed? You know how much discussion there is about crop residue burning in the country. So all these are things that determine crop management as well as soil erosion. All of this, no one is talking about soil erosion, but I'm sure it's a factor because these regions that are affected by crop residue burning, they also have very high levels of dust storms in the summer. Then we come to p-values, and p-values for contour farmed terraces are related to the slope gradient. So you have the contour factor and the strip crop factor. So all of this, all these factors together can be multiplied to determine, to come up with an estimated soil loss per unit area for the year. So it's an annual figure. Yes, so I think I've covered everything. So cover and management factor is crop stage factor. Crop canopy is how much of the area is covered by the crop. Residual mulch is what I just talked about. So if the residue is left on the field and it's not as dry as, so in the temperate regions, the mulch is not so dry, it remains moist. In our country, unfortunately, the residue is extremely dry, and that's why they burn it, I think.
Ma'am, you are on mute. Ma'am? Ma'am, you are on mute, ma'am.
When did I go on mute? Okay. Okay, so
That's soil pollution, ma'am. When you were the previous slide, yes.
so soil pollution is extremely important, but since we've already covered solid waste and hazardous waste management, I'm not going to spend too much more time except to say that anytime you dump waste on soil, what you're doing is exposing the soil to heavy metals, to organic contaminants. All these kinds of pollutants will eventually will become part of the soil. They will become part of the surface runoff, and they will become part of the ecosystem. So you have these problems with bioconcentration, biomagnification of organic contaminants. Now, fertilizers and pesticides are what you see as major agricultural chemicals. So these are the things that we apply to the fields, and they can leach into the groundwater. They can be contaminants in groundwater. They will go by surface runoff and pollution. They will become part of the surface water bodies, and they will concentrate in the plants and get magnified up the food pyramid. So all these things we have covered in all the other topics, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This is the end of this topic. There are some problems over here, and the answers are also given. So I'll be uploading the slides right away, and this will be on your syllabus. So this is all part of your syllabus. Okay. Any questions? I don't know if I can answer them, but let's see. Is everyone there?
Quite a few students are here, ma'am.
Yeah. No questions? All are fine? Okay. Right. Okay, then. I will stop at this point, and